Hey everyone, welcome to the Got 10 Minutes podcast, the podcast for product teams, brought to you by Samelogic.com, the social product development network to get amazing ideas from anyone and anywhere. Today we speak with Jeff Appel, who is the lead designer at Ghost Town Creative Services. Hey Jeff, welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
It's going great. I'm really interested in your background, Jeff. I'd love to understand, like how you got into TUX. I'd love to understand like what motivations or what things you experienced to cause you to go in this route. So take me as far back as possible. Where did Jeff start?
Yeah, it's a great question. Probably around 2008, I started working with a local UX agency here in Denver called Effective UI. I was working with them doing just some copywriting and copy editing. That was kind of my job title. But I worked pretty closely with some of the designers in some of just the work that they were doing. So I was doing some proto UX writing. I was looking at microcopy. I was helping with information architecture, structuring, and one of the co-founders of this agency pulled me aside one day and he said, "Hey, let's go out to lunch." And he encouraged me to become a designer. At the time, I thought that was a really cool idea, but there was really no easy way for me to get the hard skills that I needed because I didn't really have any. So I went to school and studied English. So I said, "That's really cool. I've always wanted to go to grad school to be a professor, so I'm going to do that instead." So I actually went to grad school, studied a PhD in philosophy and religious studies. I've always been interested in kind of like big ideas. And towards the end of it, realized that it was going to be difficult for me to, I guess, like live a life as the professor that I had always dreamed of being. So one of my good friends from the agency, he actually around that time that I was finishing up my PhD, he said, "Look, you should definitely go into design. You've got a lot of soft skills that UX designers need." And at the time, there were boot camps. And so a boot camp could help me at least gain some of the hard skills I needed. So I enrolled at General Assembly, went through their kind of full-time boot camp curriculum, and then just on the other end of it was like, okay, now I guess I'm ready to be a designer. So since that time, I've been working in different contexts of, enterprise work, some kind of like smaller company, but still, corporate, as well as some startup work. So it's been quite a journey.
Oh wow. I don't think I've ever spoken to someone who is in the UX field who has a background in religious philosophy. How does that impact the way how you design, I guess, is design a way to speak with our creator? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's one main way that I kind of think about it, in that in the academic world, whether I'm writing an article or I'm actually teaching students, often it's philosophy or philosophical studies, it's cultural theory, it's theology, it's all these kind of like high-minded, like idealistic practices, where I'm trying to say, okay, so what was Kant's theory of the transcendental? And, if you're a philosophy student, it might ring some bells, but maybe you don't understand it. If you're a business studies major or an English major, that means really nothing to you. And so I kind of saw it as my job to take these big ideas and instruct or write in a way so that it starts making connections with the students or the reader, no matter where they're at. So trying to kind of break things down until you have something that you can grasp on, right? And then start kind of getting the gist of it, building more of those kind of like little elements, and then saying, "Oh, I think I understand like what this actually looks like." Design for me is actually the very same process, in the sense that often in companies, we're saying we have this idea. We know that we have certain use cases, we have certain personas, we have users or customers. We want to do this thing, but we're not sure how we're going to get there. And so as a designer, I see it as my job to say, let's break this down piece by piece. Try to figure out, what are your assumptions, product manager, when you're saying that it has to have these features? What are your assumptions, GM or anyone from like, an executive vice president, when you say it has to be like this or it has to work this way? Try and break those things down, synthesize what we know with, user research or any sort of kind of qualitative or quantitative research that we have, and then say, okay, we have all this stuff. How do we put it together and then present something that is actual tangible? It's something that someone can prototype, they can use. They can say, oh, I get this. This is kind of what it looks like. And it's also an iterative process as well, right? If you come back and say, like, I don't really understand Kant's idea of transcendental, is it this? I could say, oh, it's like that. Let's take those first two things you said, forget the third one because it's kind of off. Blend these and then think about it this way. Now you have like a kind of an iterative process where you're saying, oh, okay, now I get it, and I can like use that knowledge. Design is no different. So that's kind of like those are the parallels that I've seen between those two worlds.
Very interesting. So when it comes on to breaking things down, taking things that are infinitely large or large and breaking them down into bite-sized pieces so others can understand, what's your process behind that, especially with design, and how, yes, what's your process with that?
Yeah. So I will admit that even as somebody who studied and thinks as a philosopher and someone who works as a user experience designer, I find that I still don't ask the types of questions that sometimes I hear my peers asking, where I'm like, that is such a good question. That's exactly what we need to ask right now. And so for me, what I've realized, just as I've worked with different design peers through the years, is that some people are very, very good at asking the questions that kind of start. I guess if there's any confusion, they're asking like clarifying questions that really start to identify or shine a light on kind of these particular things that then help us see, oh, I see. So you might be assuming that it has these features because maybe you were asked to put these features into it. Are the features really necessary to our end users? Well, we may not know that, right? And so you start kind of identifying some of those assumptions as they're given to us in a design brief or something like that. So I'm trying to still learn how to ask better questions, and I really admire some people who I think they've worked really hard at this, or they just have a predisposition towards it. I don't know, but they ask like fantastic questions that really kind of start to like reveal things that might be like obfuscated a little bit.
Mm. In your experience, what are some of the most important factors you'd say to consider when you're designing experiences for like a wide range of customers? Because you've worked in many different areas, with startups and also with large enterprises. So, what are the most important factors to consider when designing experiences?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. I mean, it is amazing how it's cliche now, but it's still so true that you really have to focus on your end users. If I have a lot of B2B like SaaS experience, and what I've found to be a very helpful development over the past few years is to look less at personas and to say, oh,
Mm,
this is the persona and they have these actions. Um, it's been much more helpful to look at the jobs that need to be done. And
mm,
so in a business, we can identify, hey, if we're, like I was at Microsoft, we're building workflows for the manufacturing industry. That includes, workers who are on the manufacturing floor and they actually need to repair a machine. How do they go through the specific steps of that workflow? We can ask them about that and usually kind of figure out what is the path, what are some, more like divergent cases that, well, maybe this comes up, so you have to do these things, but it comes around. And we can differentiate those from maybe a back office manager who has a different workflow that kind of intersects with that frontline worker. So it's been really helpful to kind of identify those jobs. One, if you're in a business context, I will say too, I'm also like in the midst of it right now. So I'm contracting with a company where we're using generative AI to produce stories with illustrations for kids that are differentiated to their reading levels. The very interesting design problem in the midst of that is to figure out, how do you design for a first grader who may like just be getting used to how to use a desktop computer? How do you design for them so that they're able to choose certain qualifications that they need? What do you want the story to be about? Do you want it to be about a tiger, a bee, a human being? How do you give them the options and allow them to select it, and just like easiest, simplest way, knowing that the difference between a first grader and even a first grader in the fall of the school year, and even a first grader at the spring at the end of the first grade year, there's just like a huge developmental change like in
Mm,
that time. And the developmental change could be even in reading comprehension. It could be how they know how to use a laptop versus just a tablet where they can tap on things. And so it's been very interesting to go through this process, develop some ideas, validate them internally with kind of internal stakeholders, but then put them in front of a first grader and watch them be like, what do I do here? And they're just clicking all over the place. And so just recognizing kind of that, I guess that like dear ROMs, that simplicity, and that like in the midst of the simplicity of the designed object, you have something that is just essential to it, and that is like that anybody can use. So
mm.
that's been super challenging, is how to build in simplicity for even like a 7-year-old so that they can use it.
Wow. That's quite amazing. What you're highlighting here is, like you've kind of shown like how to be like a great UX designer or UX engineer, UX researcher. But like, what would you say are some of the key qualities or some skills that set UX designer apart from like an exceptional UX designer? What sets an exceptional UX designer from the rest, and how do you continuously work on like honing these skills?
That is an excellent question. So I've found that the designers I've been around that I admire the most, that seem to be just really extraordinary at their job, are ones who, as I said earlier, they can ask clarifying questions and they can
Mm,
kind of keep, like picking away or chipping away at something,
mhm,
so that it actually is, you're able to start seeing the whole thing for what it is. I've been around designers. Also, I've had a few managers who are like that, they're design managers who came up as designers. And so they're able to say, what about this? What's your assumption here? What are the users doing here? Why do you think that that's, happening? Or like, why did you create it that way? They're just really probing just to kind of make sure that everything is out there. We talk about curiosity as kind of a virtue for UX designers. And I think maybe that ties in how I see the curiosity is like the story I just told.
mm,
Is the designer curious enough in their context to say, is this actually what our end users need? Do they understand it? Like, what are their limitations? When I was doing the work at Microsoft for the manufacturing project in Teams, I was really surprised to find how many of the manufacturing shop floor people that we interviewed have very low tech fluency. So their frustration was like, look, I don't need something that's just overly complicated, that has, a tons of different widgets that kind of slides back and forth. I just need this simple thing that helps me get this job done. Literally,
mm,
just give me a button and then takes me to the next step. Give me 2 fields so I know which one to choose, right? If I'm working on a certain machine, give me an easy camera access so we can put QR codes and my tablet can actually read that machine and just pops up in front of me. That's what I found curiosity really to kind of like encompass, is this like, can I actually get into the midst of the people that I'm designing for, understand their context, their limitations, what they like and what they don't like, and design around those. Because I do think, as designers, it is easy to kind of look at the stuff, look at the research, look at usability studies, talk to end users, but then say, okay, I have an idea and I'm going to do it my way because that's kind of how I would understand it. There's kind of a step more where it's always just kind of interrogating those assumptions. This is what I have to do: interrogate my own assumptions and go back and keep putting them in front of people so that they say like, no, this isn't even close. This is no good. Like, in a sense, you have to be more curious about it. Help me so that I can actually get these things done through the thing that like I'm designing. So yeah, I think that ability to ask really good questions and to like be curious about the people you're designing for really has kind of set some designers apart, at least in my experience.
mm. Great questions and have a sense of curiosity. Very interesting. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned that have helped you to be like better at your role? You've mentioned like quite a few of them. But what would you say are like the 1 or 2 or 3 key things that have allowed you to be like much better at your role?
I think for me, one thing that helps me personally is persistence and like humility. I guess those two things brought together. As I said, I I didn't come from a design background, never went to art school or anything like that. I am a boot camp kid in that I came into UX design kind of later as a second career. And what I've found is that I have an ability to do the work really well, but I'm trying to at least approach it with this sort of humility of like, I also don't know what I'm doing. There are a lot of people who are very good at this. So I do try to ask as many questions as possible. And I try to just be okay with looking dumb. So whether it's, a usability study and putting it in front of a certain kind of, user group and having them just say like, man, this stinks. Like it's no good. Or why did you do this? This is so confusing. It's okay to be like, yeah, I don't know. We got to make this better for you all. But also like internally in the teams that I'm working with, quite often, what I've found is that it's difficult. So you've got the job as a designer, just as it is, right? And all the things that you should do to be a good designer. But then you're plopped down into different like industry verticals that you may or may not know anything about. And so I worked for a construction tech startup a few years ago, and it was amazing to me on a daily basis to have it revealed to me how little I knew about the industry, how it works, what different groups, their jobs that needed to be done. And so I did feel like a huge dummy for like the first year because I was just like asking a ton of questions, especially like even internally. I'd be in a meeting with, just different stakeholders, and the CEO would say like, well, you do this, blah, blah, blah. And he might throw out an acronym, and everybody who has come out of the construction industry understands the acronym, but I don't know it. So I'm like, what does that mean? And so just trying to like keep asking those questions, stay humble, trying to kind of just learn those things and be okay with it. Like, I may be like a senior designer, a lead, or a principal, but it's still okay just to ask those questions when you don't know what's going on.
Mm, very, very, yeah, I really love the focus on, asking questions and like not being afraid to, lack of a better term, like look stupid. But is that's a way how you really understand what's happening. Sometimes you don't know what you know, but what you don't know what you don't know. And the only way you get to that is by asking the right questions. So I really, really love the focus on this. And I think that's also what's lacking in the industry. People being like overconfident or a bit too confident in what they're thinking because they assume this is what the user wants. But I love the focus on this. What are some of the most challenging things you'd say that you do on a daily basis?
So I worked with a designer, like a principal designer turned manager at Microsoft, great dude. And one day we were just ideating and trying to kind of move through a specific problem that we were facing like on the project that I was working on. And he was aware of the project, so he kind of had some context. And so he and I were just kind of talking it out. And he said to me at one point, he said, Jeff, the easiest part is drawing. It's all this stuff that we're doing right now that is just like really, really complex. And I thought there was a lot of wisdom in that insight, in the sense that if we're able to, as designers, if we're able to really understand use cases, jobs to be done, scenarios, user journeys, kind of all those pieces, those kind of more like artifact driven pieces of design. If we're also able to investigate research, qualitative, quantitative research that you may or may not have, or maybe you've done or need to do, if you take those things together and then marry them with what are the project requirements, what are the technical limitations and things that we can and can't do, have we tried this before and it's failed? Why did it fail? What are our business goals? How is this going to actually generate enough profit and income that it like keeps me in a job, in a paid position? It's like all those things are just always, it's like a dynamic relationship where those things are always moving around. And as designers, we kind of have to figure out which of those areas, which of the different prerogatives do we kind of prioritize, right? That's incredibly difficult, I think. And personally, when I went through boot camp. It's just one of those things that we touched upon in the sense of saying, these are the things, the plates that you'll have to keep spinning. But that is a really tricky thing. And to my friend Carlos and his point, he said, once you get those things and actually figure out a point of view, a solution to the problem statement, then you can start drawing. It often just kind of comes out of you and says, okay, well, that means it has to do these certain things. Or you're working within a design system. And so you can say, oh, here's like 80% of it's covered. And here are some of the new components that we have to create based on, some of the context needs. So I think that's really true. I think the drawing is, for the most part, the easiest part, where all the stuff that leads up before that is pretty hard, pretty difficult.
I completely agree. This is my last question here. What's one weakness that you've turned into your strength? This is like one question I ask everyone who comes on the show, and everyone always has like a different response. So I'd love to hear what your response to this is as well.
So I think just by personality or disposition, I'm someone who I'm fairly black and white thinker. I tend to kind of have like a high drive towards like a certain goal. I want to actually kind of like live, I want to live like a good life. I want to live, an ethical life. I want to actually have certain, make decisions that lead me to just kind of this like, flourishing of not just myself and my family, but for, all of humankind. I think the shadow side of that is that it's very easy for me to be critical or to defend like my own decisions as the only one that could possibly be made in this situation, right? And so it's easier in a place like the academy, where it is highly antagonistic. There's a lot of conflict. It's easier to say, no, Dwayne, your perspective on this issue is incorrect. Here's why I think it's incorrect, and I think my position is better, right? That doesn't really fly outside of the academy. It doesn't really fly, especially in industry, where it is very much this kind of like, well, let's see what product people think. Let's see what their feedback is. Let's put it in front of users. They may hate it. They may want things like this way or that. It's tricky to then kind of put that in front of stakeholders that are sitting in real places of power. And that might, we've all had the experience where they say, well, the button should not be red. It really should be like blue. And you're like, there's just no way it should be blue, right? So for me, I've found, especially early on as a designer, it was like I was really defensive, and not just defensive in feedback, but defensive of like my work in terms of saying like, oh, like I just have to do this perfectly, the first time, every time. So what I've learned is like it's okay to recognize that shadow side of my personality and my skills, and to say like it's fine, especially in this role. It's fine to say, hey, I've done the best I can to synthesize all the things that I need to hold them together, to create something tangible that then someone looks at and says, actually, it ought to be like this instead. I'm much more receptive to that sort of feedback these days, both because it just helps me as a person, and maybe somewhat like, I don't want to be glib about it, but it's like, it's not the end of the world. If we have to change this, sign up screen so that it does a certain thing, like who cares? It's all good. Like I may disagree with that, but I'm just going to commit to that, and it's fine. And we're going to move on with our lives because we have better things to focus on. So yeah, that's kind of what I've tried to do in terms of being a little bit softer, more receptive to feedback and criticism, and to turn it into kind of some a strength for the thing that we are collaborating and creating together.
Wow, I love that response. Thank you so much for joining us today and reminding us that we're always supposed to be curious, and also to ask remember that the quality of the questions. Ask better questions, because at times the questions may be better than the answers, because without the right questions, you won't have the right answers. Thank you so much for your time today, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne. I appreciate it.
Awesome. And thanks for listening to the Got 10 Minutes podcast. To stay in touch, follow us on LinkedIn or the podcast app you're listening to this on right now for more episodes. Take care. Bye.